Some houses are forgotten by people, but not by what waits beneath them. The first thing Daniel Mercer noticed about the mountain house wasn't the silence. It was how the silence seemed to listen back. The road leading up to it twisted for nearly 3 miles through pine and granite, a narrow strip of cracked asphalt that locals in town avoided after sunset, not out of fear exactly, but out of something harder to explain. They had laughed when Daniel signed the papers, right there in the small real estate office that smelled faintly of dust and old coffee. A fixer-upper, they called it, though no one had stepped inside in over 15 years. The roof sagged slightly on one side, the windows were clouded with age, and the porch leaned just enough to make a man question his footing. "You'll last a week," one of them had said with a half-smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Daniel hadn't argued. He rarely did anymore. At 40, he carried himself with the quiet steadiness of someone who had already seen too much noise. His shoulders were broad, his movements deliberate, and his face, lined not by age but by memory, remained unreadable even when people tried to provoke him. Beside him, Scout sat calmly in the passenger seat of the old pickup, his amber eyes tracking every movement, every shift in tone, every subtle change in the air. The German shepherd had been trained to notice what others missed, and though the war was years behind them, some instincts never faded. When they reached the property, the sky had already begun to dim, a pale gray light stretching thin across the ridgeline. The house stood alone against the mountain, half shadowed by tall pines that whispered softly in the wind. Daniel killed the engine, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then Scout's ears lifted. Not sharply. Not in alarm. Just awareness. Daniel stepped out, boots crunching against gravel, the cold air settling into his lungs like something clean and distant. He took in the details slowly, the warped wood of the porch, the faint creak of shifting beams, the way the wind seemed to pass through the structure rather than around it. It wasn't ruin. It was something held together by habit. Inside, the air was still, carrying the scent of old timber and stone. Dust lay across the floor in soft layers, undisturbed except for the faint trails left by time itself. Daniel set his pack down near the doorway and began moving through the space with quiet efficiency, checking windows, testing floorboards, noting every imperfection the way he once mapped unstable ground overseas. Scout moved differently. He didn't inspect. He listened. His paws made soft, measured taps against the wooden floor, his nose lifting occasionally as if catching something just beyond reach. When Daniel reached the back room, where the floor sloped ever so slightly toward the mountain wall, he paused. It was subtle. Almost nothing. But the air felt heavier. He couldn't explain it, and he didn't try to. Scout entered a second later and stopped completely. His body stiffened, not in fear, but in focus. His ears angled forward then slightly back, adjusting to something Daniel couldn't hear. The dog took 2 slow steps toward the center of the room, then lowered his head and exhaled sharply through his nose. Daniel watched him, saying nothing. He had learned long ago that Scout didn't react without reason. The house creaked softly, the kind of sound old wood makes when temperature shifts. Outside, the wind brushed through the trees, carrying a low, steady murmur that blended with the structure itself. But beneath that, there was something else. Not a sound exactly. More like a rhythm. Faint. Measured. Easy to ignore if you weren't looking for it. Scout's paw lifted and rested gently against the floor. He held it there for a moment, then pulled it back and looked up at Daniel, his amber eyes wide, questioning. Daniel stepped closer, his boots pressing into the aged wood. He stood still, letting the silence settle again, letting the layers separate the way they used to when he listened for danger in places that pretended to be calm. There it was. Barely there. A subtle vibration. Not random. Not natural. Something repeating, steady as a heartbeat buried deep beneath stone. He crouched slowly, placing his palm flat against the floorboards. The wood was cold, but beneath it, something pulsed. Once. Then again. He didn't count at first. He didn't need to. Scout let out a low sound, not quite a growl, not quite a warning. Recognition. Daniel exhaled quietly, his hand still pressed against the floor, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular. The house wasn't just empty. It wasn't just old. It was waiting. And for the first time since he had driven up that winding road, Daniel understood something he hadn't allowed himself to believe. He hadn't chosen this place. Somehow, in a way he couldn't yet explain, this place had chosen him. The rhythm did not stop when he lifted his hand from the floor. If anything, it became harder to ignore once he knew it was there, like a thought that refuses to leave once it has been noticed, and Daniel remained crouched for a long moment, listening with the kind of patience he had once reserved for situations where every second mattered, while Scout shifted his weight slightly, circling the same spot with deliberate care before placing his paw down again, this time pressing just a little firmer as if confirming what he already understood, and the floor answered with that same faint pulse beneath the wood, steady and measured, too consistent to belong to settling beams or passing wind, and Daniel exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cooling air of the house as evening settled deeper into the mountains, bringing with it a quiet that felt heavier now, layered. No longer empty but occupied by something unseen yet undeniably present, and he stood, scanning the room again. Noticing details he had overlooked earlier, the way the boards here were slightly more worn despite no visible traffic, the faint line where two planks met imperfectly as if they had been lifted once and set back in place, not recently, but not entirely forgotten either, and he stepped back, giving himself distance, letting his mind work through possibilities the way it always had, practical first, logical, grounded. But the rhythm beneath the floor did not fit neatly into any explanation he trusted, and Scout let out a soft huff, not alarmed, not afraid, simply acknowledging, and moved toward the far wall where the wood met exposed stone. His nose tracing along the seam, pausing at a narrow crack where the mountain pressed close against the structure, and Daniel followed, kneeling again to run his fingers along the edge, feeling the difference in temperature, the stone colder, holding something deeper than the air around it, and for a moment he closed his eyes, listening not just with his ears but with that instinct he had learned never to ignore. The one that told him when something was not right even before it became clear why. And the rhythm returned, faint but steady, echoing through the structure in a way that suggested depth, not surface, something below, not within the walls but beneath them, and he opened his eyes again, looking at Scout, who held his gaze with quiet certainty, and that was enough, it always had been, so Daniel stood and moved toward the doorway, stepping outside into the fading light where the sky had shifted into a deep blue-gray. The trees swaying gently as the wind carried the scent of pine and distant cold water, and he walked the perimeter of the house slowly, boots crunching against gravel and patches of dry earth, noting the slope of the land, the way the foundation met the mountain, the slight dip near the back corner where rainwater might have once collected, and when he reached that spot, he stopped, because the ground there felt different underfoot, firmer in some places, hollow in others, and Scout joined him, lowering his head and sniffing carefully before pawing once at the dirt, then stepping back as if waiting, and Daniel crouched again, brushing aside loose gravel with his hand, revealing a surface that was not entirely natural, something flat, buried just beneath the top layer, and he cleared a little more, enough to expose the edge of what looked like old stone or concrete, weathered and worn but shaped, intentional, and he sat back on his heels, considering it. The pieces beginning to align in a way that felt both inevitable and unsettling, because whatever lay beneath the house was not accidental, it had been built, hidden, left behind, and forgotten by time but not entirely erased, and the thought settled in quietly, not as fear, but as recognition, that this place carried a history deeper than the walls above it, and he rose slowly, brushing his hands together, his gaze moving back to the house where the windows now reflected the last light of day, giving it the appearance of something watching from within, and for a moment, he simply stood there, the wind moving around him, Scout at his side, both of them facing the structure in silence, and then the dog let out 3 soft, measured barks. Not loud, not urgent, but clear, spaced evenly. A signal Daniel had heard only a handful of times before, and each time it had meant the same thing, not danger, not threat, but discovery, something significant, something that would change the path ahead, and Daniel nodded once, almost imperceptibly, his decision already made, because whatever lay beneath that mountain house was no longer something he could walk away from, and as the last light faded completely, leaving only the quiet and the steady presence of the unseen below, he turned back toward the door, knowing that by morning he would begin to uncover what had been waiting there all along, not for just anyone, but for someone who knew how to listen when the world grew still. Morning arrived quietly, not with sound but with light, a pale stretch of gold slipping through the narrow windows and settling across the worn floorboards where the rhythm had whispered through the night, and Daniel was already awake when it came, sitting at the small wooden table near the front room with a cup of black coffee cooling in his hands, his eyes not fixed on anything in particular but listening, the way he had learned to listen long ago. Not for noise but for change, and Scout lay near the doorway at first, still and composed, until the moment the first faint vibration returned, so subtle it might have been mistaken for imagination if not for the way the dog's ears lifted in perfect sync, his head rising slowly, eyes sharpening as if something deep beneath the house had just taken a breath, and Daniel set the cup aside without a word, rising with calm precision, because there was no urgency in it, no threat. Only a steady invitation that had not faded with daylight, and he moved toward the back room again, each step measured, the floor creaking softly beneath his weight as if acknowledging his return, and when he reached the center where Scout now stood waiting, the rhythm was clearer in the stillness of morning, not louder, but more defined, each pulse distinct, spaced evenly, like something keeping time far below the surface, and Daniel crouched once more, pressing his palm against the wood, feeling it travel through his bones this time, subtle but undeniable, and he did not count the seconds, he did not need to, because the pattern had already settled somewhere in his awareness, familiar in a way that made no sense and yet felt impossible to ignore, and Scout let out a low breath, stepping aside slightly as if giving permission, and Daniel reached for the edge of the nearest plank, testing it with his fingers, and it shifted just enough to confirm what he had begun to suspect, that this section of the floor was not as fixed as the rest, that it had been placed with intention rather than permanence, and he stood again, scanning the room before stepping outside briefly to retrieve the small tool kit from the truck, returning moments later with a flat pry bar and a quiet focus that had carried him through far more uncertain situations than this, and he knelt again, sliding the edge of the tool carefully into the narrow seam between boards, applying just enough pressure to lift without splintering. Because whatever lay beneath had been hidden for a reason, and he was not about to rush into it without respect, and the wood responded slowly, reluctantly, the first plank rising with a soft creak that echoed through the room before settling aside, revealing a darker space beneath, not opened yet, but layered, another surface just below, older, colder, and as he removed the second plank, then the third, the shape began to form, not random, not natural, but structured. A rectangular outline framed by beams that had aged differently than the rest, preserved by their position, untouched by light, and Scout moved closer, his nose hovering just above the opening, breathing in carefully, not tense, not alarmed, simply aware, and Daniel paused for a moment, sitting back slightly as he took in what he had uncovered, because now there was no denying it, this was not damage, not decay, this was design, a concealed entry built with purpose, hidden in plain sight beneath a house that no one had cared enough to question, and the thought settled into place quietly, that perhaps the reason it had remained untouched for so long was not because it was well hidden, but because no one had truly listened, and he leaned forward again, brushing away the remaining dust and debris until the full surface beneath was visible, a solid panel, likely wood reinforced from below, with a faint metal ring set flush near one corner, worn smooth with age, and he reached for it slowly, his fingers closing around the cold metal, feeling its weight, its resistance, as if it had not been moved in years, and for a moment he hesitated, not out of fear, but out of understanding. Because whatever lay beyond that panel would change something, not just the house, not just the land, but him, in ways he could not yet define, and Scout looked up at him then, their eyes meeting in that quiet, steady way that required no words, and the dog gave a single, small nod of movement, barely there, but enough, and Daniel exhaled softly before lifting, the panel rising with a low, drawn-out sound that seemed to come not just from the hinges but from the space below itself. As if something deep within had been waiting for that exact moment, and as the opening widened, a breath of colder air moved upward, carrying with it a faint, mineral scent, clean and ancient, untouched by time above, and Daniel leaned forward slightly, peering into the darkness that stretched below, not empty, not silent, but alive with that same steady rhythm, now clearer than ever, and he realized then, not with surprise but with quiet certainty, that this was only the beginning. That what he had uncovered was not the secret itself, but the doorway to something much deeper, something that had been waiting, not to be found by chance, but to be revealed by someone who had finally chosen to listen. The darkness beneath the open panel did not feel empty, it felt patient, as if it had been holding its breath for years and had only just now decided to exhale, and Daniel remained still for a moment at the edge, letting his eyes adjust to the faint outlines below while the cool air rose slowly, brushing against his face with a quiet, steady chill that carried the scent of stone and time, and Scout moved closer, lowering his head toward the opening but not stepping forward, his body poised with careful awareness, not fear, not hesitation, simply respect for something that existed beyond the ordinary patterns he understood, and Daniel reached for the flashlight from his pack, switching it on and angling the beam downward, revealing the first clear shape beneath the house, a narrow set of steps carved directly into the earth and reinforced with old timber, descending at a slight angle into a space that extended farther than the light could fully reach, and the beam trembled slightly in his hand. Not from nerves but from the subtle vibrations still traveling through the structure, stronger now that the barrier above had been lifted, and he watched as the light traced along the walls, revealing surfaces that were not rough or collapsed, but shaped, deliberate, worn smooth in places where time had passed slowly rather than violently, and he exhaled quietly, his breath echoing faintly into the opening, then shifted his weight forward, placing one boot carefully onto the first step, testing it, feeling the firmness beneath him, and when it held, he moved down. Another, then another, the wood creaking softly but steadily, each step bringing him deeper into the cool, quiet space below, while Scout remained above for a brief moment, watching, listening, before finally following with controlled movement, his paws landing softly, his presence close but never crowding, and as they descended, the light began to reveal more of the chamber below, widening gradually into a corridor that curved slightly into the mountain itself, the ceiling low but stable, supported by beams that had aged with a kind of quiet strength, and the air grew colder, not sharply, but consistently, as if the deeper he went, the closer he moved towards something that had never known the warmth of sunlight, and the rhythm beneath the ground became clearer now, no longer just a distant pulse but something that seemed to resonate through the walls themselves, a steady, measured presence that did not rush or change, and Daniel paused halfway down, turning his head slightly as if trying to locate its source, but it did not come from one direction, it seemed to exist everywhere at once, embedded in the structure, woven into the very space around him, and Scout stopped just behind him, his ears shifting slightly, adjusting to frequencies Daniel could not hear, and for a moment either of them moved, both simply listening, absorbing, understanding in their own ways that this place was not abandoned in the way people had assumed, it was preserved, held in a kind of quiet suspension, waiting not for discovery alone, but for recognition, and Daniel continued downward, his steps slower now, more deliberate, until the staircase finally opened into a larger chamber beneath the house. And when his boots reached the solid ground below, the sound changed, the echo deepened, the space opening outward into something far more expansive than the structure above could have suggested, and he lifted the flashlight, sweeping the beam across the room, revealing walls of natural stone interwoven with sections that had clearly been constructed, reinforced, shaped with purpose, forming a space that felt both natural and intentional at the same time, and near the center, partially obscured by shadow, stood something that caught the light differently, a surface that reflected just enough to draw his focus, and he stepped closer, each movement slow, measured, until the beam settled fully upon it, revealing a large, flat structure set into the ground, not quite a table, not quite a platform, but something in between, its surface marked with faint lines and patterns that did not appear random, and Daniel crouched slightly, angling the light to see more clearly, tracing the shapes. With his eyes, lines intersecting, forming what looked like a map or a diagram, though not one he immediately recognized, and Scout moved to his side, his nose hovering just above the surface, then lifting slightly as if confirming that whatever this was, it belonged to the same presence they had felt above, and the rhythm continued, steady and unchanged. But now it felt closer, more connected to this place than before, and Daniel reached out slowly, his fingers hovering just above the marked surface before finally making contact, and the moment his hand touched it, the vibration beneath seemed to shift ever so slightly, not louder, not faster, but more aware, as if the space itself had acknowledged him, and he drew in a quiet breath, his gaze fixed on the patterns beneath his hand, understanding not in full, but enough to know that this was no simple hidden room, no forgotten storage or abandoned shelter. This was something designed with intention far beyond the surface, something that had waited not just for time to pass, but for the right moment to be opened. And as the light flickered softly across the stone and the steady rhythm continued beneath his fingertips, Daniel realized that whatever he had stepped into was not just a discovery, it was an invitation, and for the first time since he had entered the mountain house, he felt something shift within him, not fear, not doubt, but a quiet certainty that he had only just begun to understand why he had been led here at all. The moment his hand rested against the marked surface, the space seemed to settle into a deeper kind of silence, not empty, but aware, as if something long dormant had recognized the presence of touch again, and Daniel did not pull away immediately, instead letting his palm remain where it was, feeling the faint vibration travel upward through his fingers, steady and deliberate, like a signal repeating itself through time. And Scout shifted closer at his side, his breathing calm but focused, his eyes fixed not on Daniel but on the patterns etched into the stone, as if he understood that this place held meaning beyond what could be seen, and Daniel slowly withdrew his hand, exhaling softly as he studied the surface more carefully, tracing the faint lines with his eyes, noticing now that they were not random markings but precise, intersecting paths that curved and angled in ways that suggested direction, distance, intention, and he adjusted the beam of the flashlight, sweeping it wider across the chamber, revealing more details that had been hidden in shadow before, and along the far wall, partially concealed by natural stone, he noticed a series of vertical grooves carved into the rock, evenly spaced, each one aligned with a corresponding mark on the platform before him, and something about the alignment felt purposeful, like pieces of a larger system designed to be read rather than simply observed, and he stood slowly, stepping back from the platform and moving toward the wall, his boots echoing softly against the ground as the sound carried through the chamber, and Scout followed closely, his ears flicking once as the rhythm beneath the ground continued without interruption, unchanged yet somehow more present now that they stood within its reach, and Daniel raised the light to examine the grooves, running his fingers lightly along the stone, feeling the subtle variations in depth and texture, noticing that some sections were smoother than others, as if they had been touched repeatedly over time, and he paused at one particular groove that appeared slightly more worn than the rest, its edges softened, its surface faintly polished by use, and he glanced back toward the platform, the connection forming quietly in his mind, and he returned to it, crouching again to compare the markings more closely, aligning the shapes in his thoughts, recognizing that the patterns were not decorative but functional, a map of interaction rather than location, and Scout let out a soft breath, stepping forward to place his paw gently against one corner of the platform, not randomly, but with a kind of instinctive certainty that made Daniel still for a moment, watching carefully, because this was the same behavior the dog had shown before every meaningful discovery, not rushed, not uncertain, but deliberate, and Daniel shifted his position slightly, angling the light to illuminate both the platform and the grooves along the wall, and as he did, the relationship between them became clearer, the lines on the surface aligning with the vertical markings beyond, forming a system that seemed to invite movement, interaction, something more than observation, and he reached out again, this time placing his fingers along one of the intersecting lines, following it slowly toward the edge of the platform, then lifting his hand and moving toward the corresponding groove in the wall, pressing his palm gently against it, and for a brief moment, nothing happened. The rhythm beneath the ground continuing as it had before, steady and unchanged, but then, almost imperceptibly, the vibration shifted, not in speed or intensity, but in presence, as if it had turned its attention toward the point of contact, and Daniel held still, his breath quiet, his focus steady, waiting, listening, and Scout remained beside him, unmoving, his posture calm but alert, his gaze fixed forward as if he too sensed the subtle change in the air, and then, slowly, the surface beneath Daniel's hand responded, not with sound, but with a faint warmth that spread outward from the groove, traveling along the stone in a pattern that mirrored the lines on the platform, connecting one point to another in a sequence that felt intentional, guided, and Daniel stepped back slightly, watching as the light from his flashlight caught the shifting textures, revealing the faintest glow along the etched paths, barely visible but unmistakable, and the chamber seemed to breathe in response, the air deepening, the silence expanding. And for a moment, everything felt suspended between motion and stillness, as if the space itself was deciding whether to reveal more, and Daniel realized then that this was not a hidden room meant to be stumbled upon, it was something designed to be understood step by step, revealed only through patience and attention, and he lowered the light slightly, allowing the natural dimness to return, letting the faint glow along the stones stand out more clearly, and he looked at Scout, who met his gaze with quiet certainty, as if to confirm what Daniel had already begun to accept, that they were not simply uncovering a secret, they were being guided through it, one layer at a time, and as the rhythm beneath the ground continued, steady and unchanged, Daniel felt a shift within himself, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but steady, like the beginning of something that had been waiting longer than he had known, and he turned his attention back to the platform, knowing now that whatever came next would not be forced, it would be revealed only to those willing to listen, and for the first time since he had stepped into the mountain house, he understood that the true depth of this place had nothing to do with what was buried beneath it, but with what it was asking him to become. The faint glow along the etched lines did not fade when Daniel stepped back. Instead, it settled into a steady presence, like embers that had been waiting beneath ash for the right breath to bring them back to life, and the chamber responded in quiet harmony, the air deepening as though the space itself had acknowledged that the first threshold had been crossed, and Daniel stood still for a moment, allowing the sensation to settle, not rushing forward, not forcing the moment, because something about this place demanded patience rather than action, and Scout remained at his side, his posture calm but intent, his gaze moving slowly between the platform and the wall as if tracking something unseen that connected them both, and the rhythm beneath the ground continued its measured pulse. But now it felt closer, more present, as though it had moved from a distant echo into something that existed within reach. And Daniel turned his attention once more to the platform, noticing that the faint glow had revealed additional details that had not been visible before, smaller lines branching off from the main paths, forming subtle intersections that suggested sequence rather than randomness, and he crouched again, lowering the flashlight slightly to allow the dim glow to guide his focus, tracing the illuminated lines with his eyes, following their direction, their flow, until they converged at a point near the far edge of the surface. And he paused there, studying the shape carefully, recognizing that it mirrored one of the deeper grooves along the wall, not the one he had touched before, but another, positioned slightly lower, its edges sharper, less worn, as if it had not been activated in a very long time, and he rose slowly, moving toward it with deliberate care, his boots echoing softly in the chamber as the sound blended with the steady pulse beneath, and Scout followed, his steps measured, his ears flicking once as the rhythm shifted ever so slightly, not in pattern, but in awareness, and Daniel reached the groove, placing his hand just above it for a moment, feeling the air. The subtle change in temperature, the faint warmth that lingered from the previous interaction, and then he lowered his palm onto the stone, aligning his fingers with the carved shape, and again, there was a brief stillness, a pause that felt intentional, as if the space required acknowledgement before response, and Daniel remained steady, his breathing calm, his focus grounded, and then the reaction came, not sudden, not dramatic, but gradual, the warmth spreading outward from the point of contact, traveling along the newly illuminated lines on the platform, connecting one path to another in a sequence that now made sense, and the glow intensified slightly, revealing a deeper layer of the design, one that had been hidden beneath the first, and Daniel stepped back to observe, his eyes following the progression as it moved across the surface, forming a pattern that felt less like a map and more like a message, something meant to be read through movement rather than sight alone, and Scout let out a quiet breath, stepping closer to the platform once more, his paw lifting briefly before resting near one of the intersecting points, not touching the surface directly this time, but hovering just above it, as if he sensed that the next step required more than instinct, and Daniel understood, not fully, but enough to know that this process was unfolding in layers, each one building upon the last, and he returned to the platform, crouching beside it, his hand hovering over the newly revealed intersection, and he hesitated, not from uncertainty, but from respect, because whatever this place was, it was not meant to be rushed, and he placed his fingers gently along the line, following it as it curved toward the center, and as he did, the rhythm beneath the ground responded again, this time with a subtle shift in tone, not audible in the traditional sense, but felt like a change in pressure that moved through the air and settled into the space around them, and the chamber seemed to expand slightly, the walls drawing back just enough to alter the perception of distance, and Daniel felt it then, a quiet realization forming beneath the surface of his thoughts. That this was not simply a hidden structure beneath a forgotten house, it was something designed to respond, to adapt, to reveal itself only through a series of intentional steps, and he withdrew his hand slowly, watching as the glow stabilized, the pattern now complete in its current form, and for a moment, everything returned to stillness, the rhythm steady, the light faint but constant, and Scout looked up at him, his amber eyes calm, certain, as if confirming that they had reached another threshold, and Daniel stood, taking in the chamber once more, seeing it differently now. Not as a place to be explored, but as a presence to be understood, and he exhaled softly, the sound echoing faintly through the space, and in that quiet moment, he realized that whatever lay deeper within this mountain was not waiting to be uncovered by force or curiosity, it was waiting to be approached with intention, and as the steady pulse continued beneath their feet, Daniel knew that the next step would not come from searching harder, but from listening more closely than he ever had before. The chamber did not grow brighter, yet Daniel could see more than before, as if the space itself had adjusted to his presence, revealing not through light but through awareness, and he stood at the edge of the platform once again, his gaze steady, his breathing slow, while the faint glow traced its quiet paths across the surface like veins beneath stone, and Scout remained close, his posture relaxed but attentive, his eyes following movements that Daniel could not fully perceive, and the rhythm beneath them continued unchanged in its pattern yet deeper in its presence, like something that had begun to recognize them not as intruders but as participants, and Daniel lowered himself once more. This time not to search, not to test, but to listen, his hand hovering just above the surface without touching, his focus no longer on what to do next but on what the place itself might be asking, and for a moment, nothing shifted, the silence holding steady, the air cool and still, until Scout moved, not abruptly, not with urgency, but with a quiet certainty that drew Daniel's attention. And the dog stepped toward the center of the platform, placing both front paws carefully along one of the illuminated lines, aligning himself with the pattern in a way that felt intentional rather than instinctive, and then he stilled completely, his head slightly lowered, his ears relaxed but aware, as if waiting, and Daniel watched closely, recognizing that this was different from before, that Scout was not pointing something out, he was responding to it, becoming part of the sequence rather than simply guiding it. And Daniel shifted his position slightly, moving to the opposite side of the platform where another line curved inward, mirroring the one beneath the dog, and he hesitated only briefly before lowering his hand to match the alignment, his fingers resting lightly along the stone, not pressing, not forcing, just present, and for a heartbeat, everything held still, the chamber suspended in quiet balance, until the rhythm beneath them changed, not faster, not louder, but layered. As if a second pulse had joined the first, slightly offset, creating a pattern that felt more complex, more complete, and the glow along the platform responded, deepening in tone, the lines no longer faint but steady, their intersections brightening just enough to reveal a shape that had been hidden beneath the earlier patterns, and Daniel felt it then, not as a thought, but as a sensation, a subtle shift in the space around him, as if the chamber had expanded inward, opening something not in the physical sense, but in the way the air held itself, and Scout remained perfectly still, his presence grounded, his breathing even, and Daniel mirrored that stillness, allowing the moment to unfold without interference. Because it was clear now that this place was not meant to be solved, it was meant to be understood through alignment, through presence, through a kind of quiet cooperation between man, animal, and something older than both, and the stone beneath his hand warmed slightly, not enough to startle, but enough to confirm that the connection had deepened, and the second pulse beneath the ground continued, weaving into the first until the rhythm felt whole, like a pattern that had finally found its missing piece, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, a section of the platform near the center shifted, not rising, not opening, but adjusting, the stones sliding just enough to reveal a narrow seam that had not been visible before, and Daniel lifted his hand, watching closely as the seam widened into a thin line of darkness, perfectly straight, perfectly placed, and the glow along the surrounding lines dimmed slightly, as if transferring its presence toward this new point of focus, and Scout stepped back then. His role complete for the moment, his gaze lifting toward Daniel with that same quiet certainty that had guided him since the beginning, and Daniel moved closer to the seam, crouching once more, his fingers hovering above it, feeling the faint current of cooler air rising from below, different from the first opening, deeper, older, carrying a stillness that felt untouched by anything above, and he paused, not out of hesitation, but out of respect. Because whatever lay beneath this second layer was not just hidden, it had been protected, revealed only through a sequence that required more than curiosity, and he exhaled softly, his breath steady, his mind clear, and as he reached forward to trace the edge of the seam, the chamber responded once more, not with movement, not with sound, but with a quiet shift in presence, as if acknowledging that the next step had not been taken yet, but had already been accepted, and Daniel understood then that this was the threshold, not of discovery, but of meaning, that whatever lay beyond this narrow opening would not simply change what he knew, it would change how he understood the reason he had been brought here at all, and as the layered rhythm continued beneath his feet, steady and complete, he remained there for a moment longer, listening, not to decide what to do, but to be certain that he was ready to hear what came next. Daniel did not move immediately, not because he hesitated, but because he understood that the moment itself required stillness, the kind that allows something deeper than thought to settle into place, and the narrow seam before him remained quiet, a thin line of darkness that seemed less like an opening and more like a boundary, something that separated what had already been revealed from what had yet to be understood. And Scout stood just behind him, his presence steady, his breathing calm. His gaze fixed not on the seam itself but somewhere beyond it, as if he could sense what waited on the other side without needing to see it, and the layered rhythm beneath the ground continued, two pulses now moving together in quiet harmony, no longer separate, no longer searching, but complete in a way that made the entire chamber feel aligned, as if every part of it had been waiting for this exact configuration to occur. And Daniel lowered his hand slowly, his fingers brushing the edge of the seam with deliberate care, feeling the subtle shift in temperature, the faint current of air that rose from below, carrying with it a stillness that felt older than the structure around it, and he traced the line gently, not pressing, not forcing, simply acknowledging its presence, and in response, the stone beneath his touch seemed to soften, not physically, but perceptually, as if the boundary itself had begun to recognize him as part of the sequence rather than an outsider to it, and the glow along the platform dimmed further, drawing inward, concentrating toward the seam, until the faint lines that had guided him here faded almost completely, leaving only the narrow opening as the focal point of the entire space, and Daniel exhaled slowly, his breath steady, his mind clear of anything but the quiet awareness that had guided him this far, and he shifted his weight forward slightly, his hand now resting fully along the seam, and as he did, the chamber responded once more, not with sound, not with movement, but with a subtle release, a gentle shift that traveled through the stone like a breath being let go after a long hold, and the scene widened just enough to reveal what lay beneath, not a drop or a descent like before, but a second chamber, deeper, more refined, its surface smooth and deliberate, shaped with an intention that felt less like construction and more like preservation, and Daniel leaned forward slightly, angling his view to take it in, and what he saw was not what he had expected. Not a vault, not a storage space, not even a continuation of the structure above, but something entirely different, a circular room carved into the mountain itself, its walls lined with the same etched patterns as the platform, but far more intricate, far more complete, forming a continuous design that wrapped around the space like a story told in stone, and at the center of the chamber stood a single object, simple in form yet unmistakable in its presence, a small pedestal. No more than 3 feet high, its surface smooth and unmarked except for a single indentation at the top, shaped not randomly, but with purpose, and Daniel's gaze settled on it immediately, drawn not by curiosity but by recognition, because something about it felt familiar in a way he could not explain, and Scout moved closer to the edge beside him, peering down into the space, his ears relaxed, his posture calm, as if confirming that what lay below was not a threat, but something meant to be seen. And Daniel remained where he was for a moment longer, taking in the details. The way the patterns along the walls seemed to converge toward the center, guiding the eye, guiding the attention, not outward, but inward, toward the pedestal itself, and the rhythm beneath the ground shifted again, not in pattern, but in depth, becoming quieter, more focused, as if the entire system had reached its point of completion, and Daniel understood then that this was not a discovery in the traditional sense. Not a hidden treasure waiting to be claimed or a secret meant to be exposed. This was something else entirely, something that had been waiting not to be found, but to be received, and the realization settled into him with a quiet certainty that did not need explanation, and he sat back slightly, his hand resting against the stone, his eyes still fixed on the chamber below, and for the first time since he had entered the house, he felt not just guided, but chosen, not by chance, not by coincidence, but by something that had recognized in him the same stillness, the same willingness to listen, that this place required to reveal itself, and Scout looked up at him then, his amber eyes calm and steady, reflecting a quiet understanding that needed no words, and Daniel gave the slightest nod, not as a decision, but as an acknowledgement, because whatever came next was no longer a question of whether he would continue, but how he would carry what he had been given, and as the chamber below remained open, silent, and waiting, Daniel realized that the true weight of what he had uncovered was not in what lay beneath the mountain, but in what it had awakened within him. A sense that some things are not hidden to be kept away, but to be revealed only to those who are willing to meet them with patience, humility, and a quiet kind of faith. Daniel did not rush down into the lower chamber, not because he feared what waited there, but because he understood now that nothing in this place had been built for haste, and he remained at the edge for a long moment, letting the quiet settle fully around him, letting the steady rhythm beneath the stones slow into something softer, something almost like a distant memory rather than a signal calling forward, and Scout stood beside him. Calm and grounded, his presence no longer searching but steady, as if the dog too sensed that they had reached the final point of something that had been unfolding since the moment they arrived, and when Daniel finally moved, it was with a deliberate ease, lowering himself carefully through the opening and stepping down onto the smooth floor of the deeper chamber, his boots making almost no sound against the stone, and the air there felt different, not colder, but clearer, as though it had been untouched by time rather than preserved within it, and he walked slowly toward the center, his eyes drawn to the small pedestal that stood waiting, its surface unmarked except for the single indentation that seemed to hold its own quiet gravity, and the etched patterns along the walls surrounded him completely now, no longer fragments or pieces, but a full design that flowed continuously, each line connected, each curve purposeful, forming something that felt less like decoration and more like a language, one that spoke not through words but through presence, and Daniel stopped a few feet from the pedestal, his gaze steady, his breathing even, and for a moment he simply stood there, taking it in, not trying to understand it fully, because he knew now that understanding would not come all at once. It would come in the same way everything else here had, slowly, through attention, through stillness, through the willingness to listen without expectation. And Scout moved to his side once more, sitting quietly as he always had in moments that mattered, his amber eyes reflecting the faint light that seemed to exist within the chamber itself. And Daniel stepped closer, his hand lifting slightly as if guided by something deeper than intention, and when his fingers reached the indentation at the top of the pedestal, he paused, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for the moment, because everything that had led him here had not been accidental, not the house, not the silence, not the rhythm beneath the floor, and certainly not the path that Scout had revealed step by step. And he placed his hand gently into the indentation, feeling how perfectly it aligned, how naturally it fit, as if it had been shaped for that exact purpose, and for a heartbeat, nothing changed, the chamber remaining still, the air quiet, the patterns along the walls unchanged, and then, slowly, the response came, not from the pedestal alone, but from the entire space, a soft warmth spreading outward, not intense, not overwhelming, but steady and encompassing, and the etched lines along the walls began to glow once more. This time not faint or partial, but complete, the entire design illuminating at once, revealing its full form for the first time, and Daniel felt it then, not as a sound, not as a movement, but as a presence, something that had been waiting not beneath the mountain, but within it, something that had watched time pass without fading, something that did not need to be claimed or taken, because it was not a thing to possess, it was a moment to receive, and the realization settled into him quietly, that the true value of what he had found was not measured in money or history or anything that could be carried away, but in the simple, undeniable truth that some places exist to remind those who find them that stillness has meaning, that patience has weight, and that kindness, even when unnoticed by the world above, is never truly lost. And the warmth faded slowly, the glow along the walls dimming until the chamber returned to its natural state, calm and quiet, as if nothing had changed at all, yet everything had, and Daniel withdrew his hand gently, stepping back from the pedestal, his gaze lingering for just a moment longer before he turned, not with reluctance, but with acceptance. Because he understood now that this place was not meant to be explored endlessly, it had already given what it was meant to give, and as he made his way back toward the opening above, Scout rising and following at his side, the rhythm beneath the ground softened further until it became almost imperceptible, like a heartbeat fading into rest, and when they emerged back into the upper chamber, and then into the house above, the light of late afternoon had begun to settle across the mountain, casting long shadows through the windows and across the worn floorboards. That no longer felt empty, and Daniel stepped outside, the air cool and clear, the distant sound of wind moving through the trees carrying a quiet familiarity that he had not felt before, and he stood there for a while, looking out across the ridge, not thinking about what he had found in terms of secrets or discovery, but in terms of something simpler, something quieter, and Scout sat beside him, steady and loyal as always. His presence a reminder that some truths are not revealed all at once, but over time, through trust, through patience, and through the quiet understanding that what matters most is not what lies hidden beneath the surface, but what rises within us when we finally choose to listen. And as the sun dipped lower behind the mountains, Daniel allowed himself a small, almost unnoticeable breath of peace, knowing that he had not been searching for anything when he arrived, and yet somehow, he had found exactly what he needed.